class. All right, John chapter 8. So just a quick recap of what we've seen for the majority of chapter 8. We looked at, of course, Jesus' self-witness last Sunday, one of the other many times where Jesus defends his self-witness, saying, I can appeal to my own witness. He then appeals to the witness of the Father. And so then we have this rather lengthy discussion, and we'll continue that this morning, this discussion of paternity. So the Jews claim actually multiple fathers they appeal to. They appeal to Abraham, they appeal to God at a certain point, and Jesus, time after time, is always appealing to who as his authority and who is his father. It is, of course, God the Father, right? So we're going to continue to see that discussion play itself out this morning. So the very last thing that we looked at last week, ending in verse 47, Jesus had said, or back in verse 45, because I tell you the truth, you do not believe me. And if I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? And so then in verse 47, he who is of God hears God's words. Therefore you do not hear because you are not of God. Okay, so this would have been a very pointed, very cutting language that Jesus would have used against the Jews and the Pharisees here. And then their response to that in verse 48 is what? Kind of a double insult here, right? What do they say? Yes. Wow. Okay, so we've already looked at a couple of times in this class, Samaritans. We saw the woman at the well who was also a Samaritan. What did Jews think about Samaritans? They were like dogs to them. So not only that, but they also call him a demon after he had just said, you are of your father, the devil. And they say, no, we're not of the devil, you're of the devil. Almost like they don't really have a great comeback for this, right? And so in verse 49, Jesus answers them and responds that, again, he honors the Father. He says, I do not have a demon, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me, and I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks and judges. Most assuredly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he shall never see death. So if a false teacher, was going about his work, he would seek after his own glory in many instances, right? Paul alludes to this many times where we did not take advantage of you. We did not speak to you craftily in those sorts of ways. This is one of the staples of a false teacher. And so Jesus appeals to this here. He says, if anyone keeps my word, he shall never see death. Some translate, mine says most assuredly. Some of yours will say truly, truly. There are many variations on that, basically as if to say, this is a sure thing. This is absolute. You can be confident in this. And maybe even more pointedly to the language, pay attention to this, okay? And that's not the first time Jesus has used that type of language. But of course, not the first time. The Jews are not convinced yet still. In verse 52, the Jews said to him, now we know that you have a demon. Abraham is dead, and the prophets, and you say, if anyone keeps my word, he shall never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who is dead, and the prophets are dead? Who do you make yourself out to be? And we'll get to Jesus's response there in a moment. So it seems that they're really appealing to this idea of, who are you to say that you have power over life and death? Who are you to say that you have power over death in particular? They asked the perfect question, as it would happen, without knowing it. It's what Jesus has been appealing to this whole time, that he is deity. He is of God. Not only is he of God, but he is God in the flesh. He is the Son of God. Okay, so he has the authority to make remarks on this and to give authority on these things. So once again, what is Jesus continually pointing to, not just in John, but throughout the Gospels? What is he appealing to? Or what is he trying to get people to realize? Trying to point to his identity as the Son of God, as deity, right? So once again, he points to that. He appeals to his divine identity. says in verse 54, if I honor myself, my honor is nothing. It is my Father who honors me, of whom you say that he is your God. Okay, you say he is your Father. Okay, he is my Father. My words are from him, and I have my honor from him. Verse 55, yet you have not known him, but I know him. And if I say I do not know him, I shall be a liar like you. So again, kind of appealing back to you are of your father the devil, the father of lies. I shall be a liar like you, but I do know him and keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. Okay, so Jesus receives honor from God the Father. This, again, is not the first time he's done this. How does the Son honor the Father? Based upon the context of what we've read here, based upon what's just been said, it's by doing the will of the Father. The child honors the parent when they do what the parent asks of them. They honor the Father in particular, in this instance, Jesus to the Father. And so then, so the Son honors the Father will then honor the Son because of this. So there's this circular relationship, this back and forth that we see here. So he knows the Father because he keeps the word. And then it says in verse 56, Abraham rejoiced to see my day. In Hebrews chapter 11, in verse 13, this is, of course, a fantastic passage talking about many of those from the Old Testament, those that had lived in faith and those that died in faith. In Hebrews 11, verse 13, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Abraham is among that number being talked about there. He's having seen them afar off. Back in Genesis 12 and verse 3, of course, what is that talking about there? It's the promises that were given to Abraham, the three promises that the Jews staked all of their identity on, or what they should have been staking their identity on, especially that last promise that I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Even after that, in Genesis 18, verse 18, it says, Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. So we get this promise time and again. That is what Abraham was looking forward to. And he saw that even afar off. And so Jesus says, he rejoiced to see my day. Jesus is the fulfillment. He is the culmination of that promise all the way back to Abraham, even before that in the garden, when the curses were given there in the garden. So the Jews, in response to this, like so many times, where does their mind go? Jesus is trying to get them to focus on the spiritual, and then where does their mind go? It's actually not a bad question, but I think it's from the wrong motives and the wrong attitude.
He's trying to get them, like our Wednesday night study, to see the unseen.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And they're not going there at all.
Yep.
Because they're not spiritual people. They're thinking of the seen, and they're totally missing what he's saying.
Exactly. And I think that's maybe even a better way of framing it up. We talk about spiritual versus physical, but the unseen versus the seen. I think that's a good way to frame it up here. So they say, you are not yet 50 years old and you've seen Abraham. How is this possible? And one of my favorite responses by Jesus, anyone in the Gospels, is this. Jesus said to them, if there's been any doubt as to where Jesus is going with his claims of who he's claiming to be, this seals the deal. Verse 58, most assuredly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Why is that a significant phrase? Those last two words in particular. Have we seen that before?
When Moses asked God, who shall I say? And he said, I am.
Yes.
I am.
Yes. This phrase, I am, is tied so many times in the Old Testament to God. It is who God is. It is tied to his identity, that he He was, he is, and he always will be. And Jesus uses that exact phraseology in response to their question here. And he knows exactly what he's doing here. Again, we've talked so many times, he's always trying to point people to this point of his identity. In John chapter 1, it should remind us at the very beginning of the book, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was God. Even prior to that, of course, the Word was, which is talked about as Jesus there. And so, there's many times in the book of Acts where a certain word, a very specific word is used, whether it's Gentiles or the resurrection, and the crowds respond with a lot of veracity in that moment. Say, oh, he said Gentiles, or he said resurrection, let's get him. Well, in this instance, Jesus utters these two words, I am, and they get very agitated at that, to say the least. They try to kill him in this instance by picking up stones to throw at him, but he hides himself, went out to the temple, going through the midst of them, and so he passed by. Okay, so we have a chapter break here. Chapter 9 is going to be a direct continuation of what we just read in chapter 8. But before we do that, do we have any comments, anything that we missed that we want to cover here in chapter 8? All right. So let's enter into Jesus healing the blind man, chapter 9. So once again, this is continuing the period of conflict. Jesus has claimed many things. In chapter 8, he claimed to be the light of the world. And we noted in John, there are 24 times that the word light is used. 23 of those instances, it's referred to Jesus, or it's associated with Jesus. So he's claimed to be the light. He has just claimed to be the eternal God, very pointedly, I am. So his ability to give light to the spiritually blind is going to be demonstrated here in chapter 9 through the healing of the blind man. Very powerful lesson that we're going to look at here. So in verse 1, it says, now as Jesus passed by, so he's just removed himself from these Jews that had seek to kill him with stones, says he saw a man who was blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Okay, so going back to verse 1 here. Again, Jesus is passing by. This is directly after what we just saw in chapter 8. So he's escaping the Jews. And his disciples ask him in verse 2, when they see this blind man along with Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents? So there is already this assumption, because this man was born blind, some sin had to have taken place. This is very similar language to what you'll find in Job with Job's friends, because all of these things are thrown upon Job, all of these horrible things. They assume that Job has to be in the wrong. They assume that has to be the case. And of course, we know that that was not the case. So they're assuming something is true before actually investigating what's being talked about. And as we're going to find out, this may be a direct correlation from the teaching of the Pharisees, because the Pharisees are also going to appeal to this kind of truth. You were born in your sin, and you were teaching us, they're going to say later on. So this again goes back to preconceived assumptions, preconceived teachings, and Jesus is going to begin to scrape some of those away once again. So they know that this man was born blind. They just have to figure out whose sin it was, right? Okay. So in Luke chapter 13, just to shed some more light, no pun intended, on this particular verse, in Luke 13, verse 1, Jesus gives another example here, I believe talking to the Pharisees. There were present at that season some who told him about the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. So there were these Galileans that Pilate had killed and was using for sacrifices. And Jesus answered and said to them, do you suppose that these Galileans were worse sinners than all other Galileans because they suffered such things? So again, as if to say a similar point of what we're about to see, you assume that because these horrible things, these Galileans being killed and sacrificed, that they had to have done something wrong. They had to have sinned. Verse 3, he says, I tell you no, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. So there is a punishment coming, but it's not that this doesn't necessarily have any correlation with anything they've done. He then appeals to the tower in Siloam that fell and killed several. Do you think they were worse sinners than all other men who dwelt in Jerusalem? Again, he says, I tell you no, but unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. So someone says everything happens for a reason. I get the sentiment of what's being said there, and we don't have time to get into all of what's talked about there, very Calvinistic in nature there. No, not necessarily. They want to assume that just because maybe a really good thing happens or a really bad thing happens, oh, that's God doing that. I don't think so. Jesus says that several times as well, as we've just seen. It doesn't mean that punishment is sent from God. It doesn't mean that a good thing is sent from God. God will bring, as Luke 13, the example is given there, a final punishment will come, and that is absolutely from God. Thus, we should repent. Okay. So in verse 3, Jesus explains that this man's blindness was not due to sin, but rather, and this is very telling, rather, this was so that God's works could be revealed, so that God could be glorified. Again, Jesus is pointing to the Father. Despite the wonderful thing that Jesus is about to perform on this blind man, he's giving glory, he's giving honor to the Father. Okay, so that's very important. In Romans chapter 5, let me catch up in PowerPoint here. Romans chapter 5, in verse 1, not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. This man was born blind from birth. I know that none of us have experienced that specific thing. We all experience certain hardships, certain sufferings. What's being talked about there in Romans, the first thing that you get to do when you are presented with suffering, you get to choose how you react to it. And based upon how you react to suffering determines everything else that follows. Suffering produces endurance if you deal with it in the right way, and that endurance produces character, and eventually that character produces hope. And that's that sure anchor of the soul that we talk about so much of heaven. So I think that's a lesson for us there, buried in this story here. Let's see. Yeah, so again in verse 4, not gonna beat the dead horse here, but in verse 4, Jesus again is doing the works of God. He's doing the works of the Father. And in verse 5, he is again the light of the world. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Again, appealing to that nature of his identity. So then continuing on in verse 6, and that's going to set up really the personification of him being the light of the world, him healing this blind man. Okay, so in verse 6, Jesus heals the blind man. When he had said these things, he spat on the ground, made clay with the saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. And he said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. So he uses this clay, he puts it on the eyes of the blind man, tells him to go to the pool of Siloam. And it says there, Siloam means sent. And that's also rather interesting based upon what Jesus is doing. He sends him to sent. there's probably something there. We're not going to explore that too much this morning, but I think that that's also rather telling. So he puts the clay on the eyes. Somebody might say that's a skeptic. Oh, Jesus didn't have anything to do with this. There were certain properties in the clay, that sort of thing. Is that what's being talked about here? No. There are no sorts of magical, mystical properties within the clay here. So the question you might ask is, why does Jesus do that? And I'm just going to throw this out to you all for a second. Let's discuss this. Why do you think Jesus chose to use clay in this instance? Because again, by my count, Jesus never performs two miracles the same way. It's always in a slightly different way. So why does he choose to do it this way?
I don't know, the spit kind of gets me.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm sorry,
Right.
but I'm just.
There must be a lot of spit in order to make enough clay.
Sure.
I was thinking of the spit must, just spit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe it's foreshadowing the scales falling from the eyes.
Oh, talking about Paul there in the book of Acts. I'm going to talk about that here in a moment. I think there is maybe a correlation, not a foreshadowing per se, but I think there's some similarities maybe in what comes about of each of those. I'll say that. Mr. Martin?
I think Jesus is making a connection with this man. And he's using the device of the clay and the spit to do that. There's nothing inherently in either one. It was available for Jesus to use to bring about him receiving sight.
Mm-hmm.
It's a parallel of baptism. There's nothing special in the water. It's an agent that's used to bring about God's plan or God's will.
Yeah.
Right. And so Jesus provides this to him, and that he then had to go to the pool of Siloam. No other pool would have worked.
Yeah.
He had to go where he was told to go, and he had to do the menial thing, kind of like Naaman, dipping in the Jordan 7 times.
Yeah.
Right. It was available, and the lesson was made, and it was a lasting lesson for that man's heart.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, his eyes got sight, but his heart was what was changed. Because we see later on, did this make a difference in this man's heart?
Mm-hmm.
And it truly did, because there was no backup in this man after he received the sight of who did this to him
Mm-hmm.
and with him.
Yeah.
He received sight just like we receive forgiveness.
Yes. Mr. Leary?
And I think Jesus also had a purpose here for this man to be healed, but then initially not know what Jesus looked like.
Mm-hmm.
And this actually serves a purpose as you go through this chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And so he gets to debate the Pharisees without the help of Jesus and whips them.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting how he, he doesn't know. He knows somebody did it, but he doesn't know. And so it serves another purpose, like you say.
Yes. Yeah, I think all of those things certainly involved in this account. So some other things that I've considered as well, talking about what Jesus has hammered on so many times, of him being the Word, of him being the light. First of all, kind of piggybacking on what Mr. Martin said, this would have produced a tremendous amount of faith in this man, the way in which this was carried out. And maybe even another point, Jesus never does the same miracle twice in the same way. Also, nobody could have replicated how he did this. There are multiple elements of what's done here. So maybe there's something to that as well. But also, this probably also refers back to Jesus being the Word. Jesus uses saliva. Maybe that's a physical demonstration of a spiritual application of the Word and the light of God, which brings truth, it brings clarity, all of these elements that Jesus has talked about. He is healing these dulled senses. This man is blind, and the Word of God brings clarity, brings light to the table here. Now, on top of that, this is a man who is blind, so he's in darkness. And he is now, as Mr. Larry alluded to, he's not going to see the light immediately. Jesus is going to go off and he's going to have this discussion with people, but eventually this is going to lead to him actually physically seeing the light. But I think there's a spiritual application there as well. Jesus, of course, being the light of the world, as we've already noted. Just to go through some quick slides here. These are just, or this is an artist rendering of the Pool of Siloam, and it was found actually rather recently, in the early to mid 2000s. It was excavated and found. So people didn't entirely know where it was, and I'll get to that here in a moment. There were some other elements that had been found. The Pool of Siloam, it was fed with water from the Gihon Spring through a 1,750-foot tunnel, Hezekiah's tunnel. So if you go back to the Old Testament, Hezekiah reigning during the divided kingdom, there was this threat of the Assyrian kingdom coming up against Jerusalem. And as a contingency, Hezekiah had dug out this tunnel that led into the city of Jerusalem so that if they were besieged, which they were, they would have a fresh water supply and they could last a very long time. And they did, in fact. And so that's where the Pool of Siloam comes from. It's fed from that same spring there. Now, this tunnel actually was discovered about 100 years ago. So we knew where that was, but Pool of Siloam was still in question up until recently. Yes.
If you ever go to Jerusalem, you can walk Hezekiah's tunnel. And you'll be ankle deep. Yeah, there you go. Yep,
There you go.
This is amazing.
Yep.
Then you come out and get to see Pool Siloam.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, go
This
ahead.
is Mr. Klein, who I've taken some other photos from. But yeah, you can see how wet he is, even above the knees here in some places in the tunnel. So yeah, it's rather extensive. Again, this is a artist's rendering. Actually, I think some archaeologists that had put this up at the pool itself, of what it would have looked like. And it's rather interesting in terms of the scale of this. It would have been about 75 by 75 yards. So you think about that in terms of an American football field, how big that would be, even a European football soccer field. That's still about 3/4 of the length, and it's exactly the width just about of a soccer field. So this was a very large pool. And you see the steps that are leading down into the pool. These are the actual steps. The pool itself is no longer in existence, of course, but these were the steps that would have led down into the pool. So I can give you kind of a visual of what we're talking about here. And I want to back up just a second. So you see where Jesus has already come from at the temple. And then he's come down as he passed by these Jews and he saw this blind man. So this is really not that far from the temple itself. He didn't get very far before this encounter. Okay, so that's going to be a little important as we encounter some more characters here in a moment. All right, looking at verse 8. Therefore the neighbors and those who previously had seen that he was blind, so all of the ones that had known that he was blind from birth, that had seen him going in and out of the temple all of those days, is not this he who sat and begged? Some said, this is he. Others said, he is like him. He said, I am he. Therefore they said to him, how were your eyes opened? He answered and said, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and I received sight. Then they said to him, where is he? He said, I do not know. All right, we'll stop there for a moment. Okay. So those around him, those that knew him, again asked, was this really the blind man that sat here all of these years? Absolutely it was. And they're going to end up asking this man in particular if he is that certain man. And so in verses 10 and 11, he says, yes, Jesus healed me. And again, faith building, but also he's able to point to exactly how this happened. Even though he was blind, Jesus is using things to where he could point and say, I did this, I did this, I did this. This is how it happened. Even pointing to maybe how Jesus did some of his other signs. People could say, oh yeah, that sounds like Jesus. Maybe even perhaps. So then verse 12, of course, he says, I don't know the man. I don't know who healed me. I just know that now I can see. Okay, so continuing in verse 13, they brought him, so they don't know what to do with him, really. They've talked to him for a brief moment. They don't really know what to do with what he's told them here. So what do they end up doing? They bring him to the authorities, to the Pharisees. Verse 14, now it was a Sabbath. Oh boy, here we go. It was the Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also asked him again how he had received his sight. He said to them, he put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Therefore some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. Is that something we've seen before? Absolutely it is. They have that same fallback. He did it on the Sabbath, so he must not be of God. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. Okay, so very likely, as I just noted on that small chart on the map there, this is not far from the temple. So this also would not have been very far from the same Pharisees that Jesus interacted with at the middle of chapter 8. So it's also very likely that these are the same Pharisees that he had just talked to, and the same Jews. So in verse 13, the Pharisees had already challenged Jesus's prior testimony. They'd already challenged his self-witness back in chapter 8. It turns out, as we're going to see throughout the story here, it turns out they don't want any testimony. They don't want any witnesses. They don't want this to persist. And they don't want anyone else testifying about Jesus. So again, Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath. Somebody bring to mind for us, where else have we seen in John where Jesus healed on the Sabbath? In John, I'm having to get the chapter right, John 5, I believe it was. It was the miracle of the man at the pool at Bethesda that we saw there, right? Talking about that first moment where it stirred up this controversy about Jesus healing on the Sabbath. So note again, as we've noted several times, Jesus is very purposeful in healing on the Sabbath. I think we also noted it's upwards of 40 times that Jesus heals on the Sabbath throughout all of the Gospels. He's doing this with intent. He's doing this with great purpose, and he does it again here. So he's not doing these things as man, but he's doing these things as the Son of God. And he has that understanding of what God is able to do. Okay. So the man in verse 15, he testifies to the facts of his healing. And this is a man that has experienced these things firsthand. He knows what happened. He's giving them the testimony. As it turns out, again, they're not going to accept that testimony. He's going to give it a second time. They don't like it that time either. But he gives truthful and accurate testimony in this instance. They ask a question in verse 16, the second question, verse 16. How can a man who is a sinner do such signs? Indeed, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? Not only that, how can a man do these things? Again, Jesus pointing to that he is God. He is the Son of God. I am, as he said in verse 58 of chapter 8. So the blind man believes in verse 17. He believes at least at the outset what about Jesus? What does he say about Jesus in verse 17? He was a prophet. Okay. This is not the first time again that this claim has been made. But again, this is this man walking by faith. He's learning one step at a time. He knows that because of what happened, this man has to at least have been sent by God. He has to have been of God. Therefore, he is a prophet. Now, again, the Pharisees are not concerned with his testimony. In verse 18, it says the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight until, this is very telling, until they called the parents of him who had received his sight. What was a large majority of the discussion about in chapter 8? What was this whole discussion about? In chapter 8, going back to chapter 8. So we have this discussion of who is Jesus's father, who is the father of the Jews. Okay, and they rejected that notion. And they rejected any notion that Jesus gave to who their father was. So now they're using that same process, saying, okay, let's get the parents in here because they're going to know. It's kind of backwards, guys, in what they're bringing forward here. So in verses, let's just go ahead and jump down to verse 20. So they'd already asked, is this your son that was born blind? Verse 20, his parents answered them and said, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind. But by what means he now sees, we do not know, or who opened his eyes, we do not know. He is of age. Ask him. He will speak for himself. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. Okay. So the first thing to note there in verse 21, he is of age, ask him. This is just kind of an aside, but in Jewish society, first of all, to be a man, that was a lot. Your testimony would have been accepted more times than not. Not only that, he was of age, and he had experienced these things firsthand. So they said, ask him. So you would assume in some sense the parents are appealing to reason here. But we find in verse 22, again, what environment had been created by the Jews? It's this environment of fear and intimidation.
Well, Gabriel, they did it based upon where they got their power and where their source or basis for that was, and that was the synagogue, and that was through the law of Moses, and it wasn't as a child of Abraham. And we see this. This is a good chapter to begin to see how Jesus draws a contrast between children of Abraham and those that follow the law of Moses. And Jesus is driving a wedge here very intentionally, that you can't call yourself a son of Abraham and behave as you are. And every time you turn around, their only answer to that response is, you violated the law of Moses. And Jesus is going back beyond that to the promises given to Abraham. And he takes it to that, other level. This is a real problem for them. And so when the parents say, ask my son, yeah, it's a bit of a dodge for fear, but at the same time, they have very assuredly said, this man, our son, is of age and he's a man. He is a legitimate witness for whatever he says. And unless you can say he's bearing false witness, according to the law of Moses, his testimony should stand according to the law. Right?
Yeah.
And so the Pharisees have a real dilemma here.
Yeah. And in fact, with that, the Pharisees would not have been following the law if they had tossed these guys out. They are tossing them out. We find they end up tossing the blind man out of the synagogue, but they don't do it for any reason pertaining to the law. It is only based upon the fact you proclaim or you testify of this man Jesus, right? You're talking about this man Jesus. So it's not even on any based terms.
There, I think it's Alice in Wonderland where you have verdict first and then the evidence. These Pharisees, conclusion first, then the evidence. The evidence doesn't matter. It's got to line up to the conclusion. And then you have the parents, unfortunately, throwing their son under the bus, where they were there. They knew the conclusion, but they wouldn't admit it.
Right.
They knew it, and so no conclusion can be admitted. And so the Pharisees and the parents are in the same boat in a sense. But one is, the evidence is the elephant in the room that the Pharisees don't want to admit, and they're going to get whipped with this. I mean, they're going to lose the debate big time, and Jesus didn't have to say a word.
Right. Yeah. It's again an instance, Jesus leaves the scene. He does that on purpose because he knows what's about to happen. He's building faith in certain people and he's forcing people to make certain choices. And so I think that's important for us to learn as well. And that's what a master teacher does. He gets you to think, he gets you to discuss, he gets you to reason. And he does not, in fact, create this environment of fear and intimidation, which the Pharisees, these teachers, had been doing. So we see that that juxtaposition there. All right, let's continue in verse 24 here. So they again, this is the second testimony of the blind man. All right, get the parents out of here. Bring the blind man back in. Verse 24, give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner. He answered and said, whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. Then they said to him again, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered them, I told you already, and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become one of his disciples? Then they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are Moses's disciples. And we'll stop there here for a moment. So they say here in verse 24, give God the glory. We know this man is a sinner. Oh, what an ironic statement. Give God the glory. Oh, if they had been paying attention, if they had been listening, they would have been giving God the glory. Because God is the one who made this man well. But they refuse to take off the blinders, and they refuse to see what is so blatantly in front of them. Verse 25, the healed man testifies emphatically that he knows Jesus healed him, or he knows what happened to him here. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. If you want to highlight a verse in your Bible, that's one to do it. That is a great statement of belief. Again, this man reasoning and taking this one step at a time and just looking at truth for what it is in face of this intimidation and fear. And we can apply this to ourselves, certainly. There may be those in your life or soon to come who seek to create this environment of fear, this intimidation. They ridicule you. They try to get you to deny your faith by planting seeds of doubt. And doubt's not always a bad thing. We've talked about that in certain classes. But what this man is doing is, again, he is seeking after truth. So what you can do is you can at least start where this man said, or where this man started, saying, I don't know the answer to all of what you're throwing at me. But one thing that I do know, though I was blind, now I see. I can start there. I can be confident in that. You can take that back to Revelation, where there's a lot of hard things. There's hard things in Daniel, and we struggle with those, and we reason about those things and learn about those things. There are certain things that we can stand on firmly. We can start there and then move forward from there. We had mentioned just a few moments ago, Paul, on the way to Damascus, where once he had been stricken with blindness for 3 days, and then he was healed, the scales fell from his eyes, and he had received his sight once again. This was a period of Paul's life where it really shook him up. It forced him to think. He was blind, he was in darkness, and he was left with just his thoughts. And so he prayed to God, he fasted, and it forced him to face reality and to wake up and to see what was right in front of him. I'll stop there, but any comments? Yes, sir.
That's a great point. This man I can't imagine being physically blind and then getting your sight, and how that's just, I mean, that is just incredible from his perspective. We can't even imagine, but then again, we can. Like you said, we all had our spiritual eyes opened by God. And I remember that moment where I was, wow, why didn't anybody tell me this? And he was like, well, I'm showing you this now. When I found the truth, and how it was at that point, and I can't explain everything. but it's that definite point where you met Jesus,
Mhm.
and you can find a way to share that with people. And as we grow in Christ, we'll know a better way to speak it, but something happened to us on the road to Damascus.
Mhm.
It's undeniable, I guess is the thing.
Yeah.
It's just undeniable.
As it was with this man, it was nobody could deny that this man could now see.
Right.
That's one of the things that's never denied. It's denied about, is this the man or not? There's several other things here, but yeah. So you can stand firm on some things and have confidence. Absolutely. Anything else this morning? All right. We'll pick up in about verse 30 on Sunday, and we'll go from there. Thanks again, everyone, for your discussion.